Nobody at Hangar 14 called it a warship at first. That came later, after the translation work had moved far enough along that the documents recovered from the vessel's internal storage could be read with something better than 40% confidence. And even then the word warship was an approximation that Dr. Yolanda Ferris, the project's lead linguist, used with the specific reluctance of someone who knows a word is doing less work than the concept requires. What they called it in the early months, in the informal language of the people who worked on it every day, was the patient, which started as a joke from one of the structural engineers who said it, reminded him of something that had been brought into an emergency room and left there, and which stuck the way nicknames stick when they contain more truth than the person who invented them realized. The patient arrived on a Wednesday morning in March, in a desert 40 miles outside of Flagstaff, Arizona, in a manner that the three people who witnessed it from the highway later described with the uniform helplessness of people trying to report something their vocabulary was not equipped for. There was no impact. There was no sound. There was no visible descent. What the witnesses reported, in statements that were taken separately and produced accounts consistent enough to be taken seriously, was that the desert was empty, and then a shadow fell across it that was too large for any cloud, and then the shadow had a source, and then the source was on the ground, and then it had always been on the ground, in the specific way that large things sometimes seem to have been there all along once they are present. It was large, not incomprehensibly large, not the scale of the things that appear in science fiction to make a point about human smallness, but large in the way that makes you aware of your own dimensions in relation to it. Approximately 800 meters in its longest axis, roughly crescent-shaped when viewed from above, with a surface that was neither smooth nor conventionally textured, but that appeared, under the desert morning light, to be covered in structures too regular to be damage and too irregular to be decorative, like something that had been added to incrementally over a long time by people who agreed on the fundamental design but disagreed on the details. The military arrived first, as it generally does when large, unidentified objects appear in American deserts. They established a perimeter with the practiced efficiency of people executing a protocol that had been updated regularly for 30 years in anticipation of exactly this scenario. And they spent the first 6 hours attempting contact through every available channel without response. And they spent the next 18 hours conducting external assessments that established 3 things. The object was not radiating anything harmful, it was not responding to any stimulus, and it had no visible entry points. The scientists arrived at the 30-hour mark, in the convoy of vehicles that always seems inadequate when you first see what it is being driven toward. Dr. Yolanda Ferris was in the 4th vehicle, wedged between a materials physicist named Dr. Gerald Acaffer and a structural analyst named Dr. Patricia HSU, neither of whom she had met before but both of whom she had been reading for years, because the community of people who spent their professional lives preparing for the possibility of non-human contact was not large and tended toward mutual familiarity even among strangers. Ferris was a linguist by training and a xenocommunications theorist by vocation, which was the kind of career that attracted a specific type of person. Someone who had decided early that the question of how to talk to something completely unlike yourself was the most important question available, more important than the question of what to say, more important even than the question of whether anything was out there to say it to, because the how was where everything succeeded or failed. She had spent 16 years building frameworks for communication across gaps that could not be assumed to share any common reference. She had published 4 books that the mainstream treated as speculative, and that the intelligence community had been quietly incorporating into protocol design for a decade. She had thought about this moment in one form or another for as long as she could remember, and what she had not expected, arriving at the perimeter in the early morning light and seeing the patient for the first time, was that her primary reaction would be the specific, quiet, structural feeling of recognition. Not of the object itself, which she had never seen, but of the situation, which she had been living in a theoretical form for 16 years. Here it is, she thought, now we find out. The entry point was found on the third day, not by any technological means, but by a 23-year-old material science graduate student named Thomas Bryce, who had been assigned to the surface texture team, and who had been doing the methodical, unglamorous work of cataloging surface features in a grid pattern, when he noticed that a section of the hull in grid reference F17 responded differently to contact than the surrounding area, not differently in any dramatic way. Not with light or sound or movement, but with a tactile quality that he described in his notes as the feeling of something that is meant to be pressed rather than simply touched. He pressed it with the specific empirical confidence of someone who has been told to document what he finds and has decided that documentation includes testing. The hull opened in a way that the cameras positioned around the perimeter captured from 17 angles, none of which produced footage that adequately conveyed what the people present described afterward as less like a door opening and more like the vessel deciding to allow access. Inside was the beginning of everything that came after. The interior of the patient was not what the external dimensions had suggested. This was the first significant technical finding, delivered by Dr. HSU after 4 days of mapping, with the flat precision of a scientist who has decided that the correct response to something that shouldn't be possible is to describe it as accurately as possible and resist editorializing. The interior was approximately 30% larger than the exterior suggested it should be, which was not a measurement error. The mapping was done 6 times by 3 independent teams using different methods, and the numbers came back consistent every time. The space was there. The space was real. The space was simply more space than the outside of the object contained. This finding produced the first major disagreement of the project, which was about how to characterize it in reports going to oversight. The argument was not about the fact, everyone agreed on the fact, but about the language used to describe it, because the language would shape how the finding was received, and the finding was the kind of thing that could either be treated as a mystery requiring investigation or as a reason to stop trusting the measurements. Ferris watched this argument from the outside with the interest of a linguist watching language do what language does when it encounters something it wasn't built for, and eventually she said, into a brief silence, "Just say what it is and what we don't understand about it. That's always the right thing to do." Akaffer, who had been on the side of conservative language, looked at her for a moment and then said, "You're right." And the report said what it was and what they didn't understand about it, and the Oversight Committee read it and called 4 additional physicists, which was the right response, and the project moved forward. The internal structure of the patient was, in the weeks of mapping that followed, revealed to be organized around a logic that was not immediately intelligible but that was, as Akeffer said during one of the late-night sessions that became the culture of the project, clearly a logic, not random, not chaotic, not the product of accident but the product of a design philosophy that the project's engineers kept catching glimpses of. In the way you can sometimes see the shape of a joke before you understand the language it's told in. There were chambers that the team provisionally called operational, clustered toward what the external hull geometry suggested was the 4-section, that contained interfaces of a kind that no one could use, but that everyone who looked at them for long enough agreed were interfaces, surfaces and structures that were clearly designed to receive input from something with specific physical characteristics and specific cognitive expectations. There were chambers that appeared to be storage, their contents in containers that responded to the same press-not-touch quality as the hull entry and that revealed, when opened, materials and components that Akaffer's team began the long work of analyzing and cataloging. There were chambers that no one could determine the purpose of, which were documented carefully and left for later. And there was the chamber that Ferris found on day 11. She had developed a habit in the first weeks of walking the mapped sections of the patient alone in the evenings, after the day's official work was done, with a small recorder, and the kind of unhurried attention that she had found over 16 years was where the most useful thinking happened. She was not looking for anything specific. She was doing what she always did, which was spending time with a communication problem in the way that a problem sometimes requires, not analyzing it but inhabiting it, letting the shape of it become familiar. The chamber was in a section of the vessel that had been mapped but not yet assessed in detail, a corridor junction that the mapping team had tagged as structurally unremarkable and moved past. Ferris moved past it on her first 3 walks and paused at it on her 4th without being entirely sure why, the specific cognitive catch of something noticed before being consciously registered. She stood at the junction for several minutes. Then she went back to her equipment station, retrieved a full sensor suite, and returned. What the sensor suite found was a cavity in the wall of the junction that the initial mapping scan had characterized as a structural void, a space in the hull material with no apparent function. The characterization wasn't wrong exactly. The cavity existed. It was in the hull material. It had no immediately apparent function. What it had was a surface on one face that the tactile sensors identified as having the press-not-touch quality. What was inside, when the surface responded to contact and the cavity opened, was a storage medium. A physical storage medium, not unlike the concept of a solid-state drive in its basic architecture, adapted to materials and manufacturing approaches that were not human but that HFY's team, when Ferris brought them to it, identified within 3 days as analyzable, not immediately readable, but analyzable, which was the first step toward readable. What was on the storage medium was, as Ferris established over 4 months of work that she described in her notes as the most difficult and the most interesting thing she had ever done, an archive. The archive contained records of the vessel, its construction, its operational history, its systems documentation, and what appeared to be something between a crew manifest and a crew log, personal records attached to what were either individuals or roles. It was not always possible to tell which. It contained this in a language that Ferris had never encountered, and that shared no structural features with any language in any database she had access to, which meant that the translation work began at the absolute beginning, not translating from one known framework to another, but constructing the framework itself, building the grammar of an entirely unknown language from the evidence of its own patterns. She did not do this alone. She was, by the 2nd month, directing a team of 12 linguists and computational analysts, working in shifts, building and testing and discarding and rebuilding models of how the language operated. It was the kind of work that looked, from outside, like very slow progress toward an unclear goal, and that was, from inside, the specific experience of watching something that was incomprehensible become, increment by increment, less incomprehensible, not in the sudden way of a switch thrown, but in the gradual way of a room getting lighter as your eyes adjust to it. By month 4, the confidence on basic structural elements was around 60%. By month 7, they were reading the technical documentation at 75% confidence and the personal records at around 50%, which was enough to understand the shape of things without being certain of the details. What the shape of things was, when Ferris assembled the team's findings into a coherent summary and presented it to the project's full leadership at month 8, was this. The vessel, the patient, was not new. Its original construction dated, by the internal records, to approximately 400 years ago by the calendar system the archive used, which the team had cross-referenced against astronomical references in the documents, and converted to Earth years with what HFY characterized as reasonable confidence. The vessel had been built by a civilization, the archive referred to by a name that Ferris's translation rendered as something like the Inheritors, which was not a name but a self-designation, the way a civilization might call itself by what it considered its defining quality. The inheritors had built the vessel as what the documentation described as a strategic reserve vessel, which was the closest English translation of a term that appeared to mean something more specific. A vessel maintained not for active deployment, but for contingency. A weapon held in reserve against a scenario that might require capabilities beyond what active deployment vessels carried. The vessel, in other words, had never been used in the way it was designed to be used. What it had been used for, in the 400 years of its recorded history, was a great deal of modification. The crew logs readable, at 50% confidence, as a record of the people who had maintained and operated and thought about the vessel across generations, documented a continuous process of assessment, upgrade, alteration, and refinement, conducted by crews who appear to have been selected for a combination of technical expertise and what the logs characterized as, in Ferris's translation, long-term thinking. People chosen specifically because they could hold in mind the question of what the vessel might need to be in a future that had not yet arrived. This was the finding that produced the longest silence in the presentation room. The silence was broken by Colonel Warren Dix, the project's military liaison, who had the particular quality of a military man who has decided that being wrong faster is more useful than being right slowly. They were building it up for 400 years, and then they put it on the ground in Arizona, he said. That is what the records indicate, Ferris said. Why? That, she said, is where the personal logs become relevant, and where the 50% confidence becomes significant. What I'm about to tell you is my best reading of incomplete information. It may not be right. She told them what the personal logs appeared to say. The inheritors, as best as the archive documented, had been in a deteriorating situation. The records were not complete on this. The personal logs were personal, not strategic briefings, and what they contained about the larger context was the kind of fragmented, assumption-laden account that personal records always contain, where the writer does not explain what they assume the reader already knows. But the shape of the deterioration was legible. The inheritors had been in conflict with another civilization. The archive called them something Ferris translated provisionally as the Absolute, which had the quality in the source language of a name used by an opponent rather than a self-designation, for a period that spanned the last 150 years of the logs. The conflict had not been going well. Not catastrophically, not in the final logs, but in the specific way of a long war in which the momentum has shifted and continued to shift, until the direction of the eventual outcome is clear even if the timeline is not. The last entry in the personal logs was from someone whose role in the crew Ferris translated as something like chief keeper, a position that combined what in human terms would be chief engineer with something that had no human equivalent, a role oriented around the long-term relationship between a crew and a vessel as a continuous entity across time. The entry was dated, by the archive's calendar, to approximately 15 years before the patient had arrived in Arizona, which meant it had been written 15 years before arrival, not at arrival. The chief keeper's final log entry, translated at 53% confidence, was the following. We are leaving her somewhere safe, somewhere they will not look, and somewhere the people who find her will be able to learn what she can do. I have spent 30 years learning what she can do, and I have not finished learning it. That is the nature of her. She rewards the time spent. We are leaving the records because whoever finds her deserves to know her history. And because knowing her history is part of knowing how to know her. I do not know who will find her. I know they will not be us. I know the situation that requires her exists. I know she will be needed. I am trusting the finding of her to something I cannot name and the using of her to whoever the finding brings. This is not how I would choose to do this if I had other choices. I do not have other choices. She is ready. She has always been ready. She has only been waiting for the right time and the right hands. I hope the hands are good ones. I hope there is enough time for them to learn her." Ferris finished reading the translation and looked up at the room. Colonel Dix, after a moment, said, "So they hid it here because they were losing and they wanted someone else to have it." "That is my best reading, yes." "Did they know about us?" Ferris had thought about this carefully. The archive contains no direct reference to human civilization, but the astronomical references in the navigation documentation are consistent with awareness of this solar system. The choice of this specific location cannot have been random. I think they knew something was here. I don't think they knew exactly what. "And the absolute," Dix asked, "are they still out there?" "No way to know from this archive," she said. "The records are 15 years old at minimum, and the situation they describe was deteriorating. What happened after the final log entry, I cannot tell you." The silence this time was different from the previous one. Less the silence of absorption, and more the silence of people beginning to calculate. Dick spoke first. He was good at that. "What's the vessel's operational status?" Akafor answered, because the technical assessment was his. "At the level we can currently assess, most primary systems appear intact and functional in the sense that they are not obviously broken. We are approximately 8% of the way through understanding what the primary systems do and approximately 2% of the way through understanding how they interact. The weapons systems, and there are weapons systems, there are clearly weapons systems, are not something we can characterize with any confidence yet. The propulsion systems are more legible, and the preliminary analysis suggests capabilities significantly beyond our current technology. The spatial variance issue." Akafor paused. "The spatial variance issue suggests that the internal architecture involves principles we do not currently have a theoretical framework for, which means that a portion of what we are dealing with will require new physics to understand." "New physics," Dix repeated. Akafor looked at him steadily. "The vessel is here and the spatial variance is measured. The physics is whatever explains the measured data. We will develop the framework." Dix looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "How long?" "To understand everything." Akafor shook his head. "Years. To understand enough to operate the propulsion systems at a basic level, I would estimate 18 months if we prioritize it correctly. To understand the weapons systems to the same level, I would not speculate." Dix nodded slowly. Then he said something that Ferris had been thinking for weeks but had not said because it was not, strictly speaking, within her area of expertise. "They spent 400 years upgrading this thing," he said. "What would we do with it in 18 months?" The question landed in the room and did not leave. The answer to Dix's question was not 18 months. It was 4 years and 3 months, which was not a failure of estimate so much as a demonstration of the difference between the complexity you can see at the beginning of a project and the complexity that reveals itself as you go. Akafor had known there would be more complexity. He had simply been unable to know in advance how much more, because the nature of the patient was that every layer of understanding it yielded revealed another layer underneath, like a structure that had been built not to a final design, but to an open one, something that had been built with the intention that it would continue to be built. This quality, once the engineering team fully grasped it, changed the nature of the project in a way that took several months to propagate through the culture of the people working on it. They had begun with the framing of analysis. The vessel was an object to be understood, a fixed thing whose nature was to be discovered. The new framing was something more dynamic. The vessel was not a fixed thing waiting to be understood. It was an open architecture waiting to be continued. The Chief Keeper's log, when Ferris translated it with the higher confidence that came from additional months of linguistic work, contained a phrase she had initially rendered as she rewards the time spent that she later realized was more precisely something like she grows with the attention given to her. The distinction mattered. It was not that the vessel was generously complex, yielding its secrets to patient investigators. It was that the vessel was designed to develop, that its architecture was genuinely open, that it had been built with explicit provision for modification and expansion and upgrade, and that 400 years of modification and expansion and upgrade by successive crews had produced a system that was not one technology but an accumulation of technologies, layered and integrated in ways that were sometimes inelegant and occasionally contradictory, and always, at their foundation, structured to allow for more. The engineering team, when this became clear, went through a period that the project's informal history later described as the reckoning, a several-week span in which the people who had been analyzing the vessel as a closed system had to rebuild their understanding of it as an open one, which was cognitively more difficult than it sounds, because it required abandoning a significant portion of work already done and reconceptualizing the problem from different first principles. The reckoning was uncomfortable. It was also, as several members of the team noted afterward, the point at which the project became genuinely interesting in a way that it had not been before, because interesting problems are problems whose shape keeps changing. Dr. Acaffer's propulsion team was the first to move from analysis to something that could be called collaboration. It happened in the third year, in a session that Acaffer later described with the careful precision of a scientist who knows he is describing something important. The team had been working on the propulsion drive's secondary modulation system, a component whose function they broadly understood but whose operational parameters they could not fully map because the control interface was designed for a physiology and a cognitive approach that differed from the human in ways that made direct operation impossible. They had built a translation layer, an interface between the vessel's native control system and human-operable controls, and they had been testing it in increments. And on the day Acaffer was describing, they had been attempting to calibrate the modulation rate using the translation layer, and had reached a point where the translation layer's limitations were constraining what they could achieve. One of his engineers, a woman named Dr. Sophia Reyes, had suggested doing something that the operational protocol at that point technically didn't sanction. Instead of using the translation layer, she proposed modifying the modulation system's architecture directly, replacing the section of the control interface that their translation layer couldn't adequately bridge with a hybrid component, partly the vessel's native design, partly human engineering, integrated at a level below the translation layer. Acaffer had thought about it for a long time before saying yes. What happened when the modification was implemented was that the propulsion system's performance improved by a measurable amount. Not dramatically, not the jump in capability that announcements are made about, but meaningfully, in the specific way of a system that has been given something it could use. The vessel's native control system accepted the hybrid component without resistance. More than accepted, the diagnostic outputs that the team had been monitoring for 3 years showed a change that Acaffer described as the system recognizing the modification, as if it had been waiting for someone to engage with it at that level, as if it had been built to wait. This was the beginning of what the project's records called the integration phase. The integration phase was not planned. It was not the result of a policy decision or a strategic direction from oversight. It was the result of a team of engineers encountering a system that responded to their engagement in a way that made a particular approach obvious and productive, and choosing to pursue the obvious and productive thing. It spread from Acaffer's propulsion team to the structural team to the materials team to the systems team in the way that good approaches spread in scientific and engineering communities, through results, through demonstrated capability, through the specific persuasiveness of watching something work. Ferris watched it happen from the position she had occupied since the beginning of the project, slightly outside the technical work, close enough to observe the human dimensions of it, useful to the project in the specific way of someone who thinks about how meaning is made and communicated and transformed. She had continued the translation work throughout the integration phase, and the translation had continued to improve. And what the improving translation gave her was something she had not anticipated from the archive. A sense of the people who had built the patient and kept the patient and modified the patient, and finally, in an act she was still trying to fully understand, entrusted the patient to an unknown future. The chief keeper was the clearest voice in the personal logs. 30 years of entries, spanning 3 command assignments and 1 period of what appeared to be administrative leave, during which the entries became more reflective and less operational. Ferris read them in order, chronologically, as a continuous document rather than as individual records to be analyzed, and what she found was a person, not an alien, not a representative of a civilization, but a person, in the specific sense of someone with a history and a perspective, and a way of thinking about problems that revealed itself gradually through the accumulation of entries. The chief keeper had come to the patient at 32, by the inheritor calendar, in a role the logs characterized as junior systems analyst, and had worked up through successive positions over 3 decades until the chief keeper designation. The early entries were technical, operational, the records of a young professional doing their job carefully and well. The later entries were something else, the records of someone who had developed a relationship with a thing, in the way you develop a relationship with a place you have lived in long enough that it has shaped you. One entry, translated at 71% confidence, stayed with Ferris long enough that she printed it out and kept it on her desk, which was unusual for her with translated material, because translation at anything below 80% carried enough uncertainty that she was wary of attaching significance to specific phrasings. The entry said, "I have been asked today whether I would want to know how it ends. The people who asked mean the conflict, the war we are not winning. I said I do not need to know how it ends to know what the right work is now. The right work is what it has always been, which is learning what she can do and making her more able to do it. What she can do is not fixed. What she can do is what we have found so far. There is always more. I think about the hands that come after and what they will find that we did not find, and I am not unhappy about this. I am glad that there is more. The more means the work continues. The work continuing is the point." Ferris kept the printout on her desk for the remaining 2 years of her time on the project. She did not discuss it with anyone. It was not the kind of thing that fit naturally into the conversations of the integration phase, which were mostly technical, mostly oriented toward the next step rather than the accumulated weight of steps taken. But she thought about it regularly, in the quiet way of something that had settled into the background of her thinking and stayed there. The weapons systems were the last major area to yield. This was expected, given their complexity, but the timeline was longer than any of the estimates had suggested, for a reason that became clear only after the first successful interface was established in year 3. The weapons systems of the patient were not weapons in the sense that the English word describes. They were not, in other words, tools for the delivery of destructive force, though they could deliver destructive force, and did so at capabilities that the military assessment team, when they finally got readings, described in language that Ferris thought was trying to find a number large enough to anchor the scale. They were more accurately described as what the inheritor documentation called decisive systems. Systems designed not to win engagements, but to end them, to change the nature of a conflict, by introducing a capability that made the continuation of the conflict on existing terms irrational for the opposition. The distinction was important. A weapons system designed to win engagements is optimized for exchange, for delivering and withstanding force over a duration. A decisive system is optimized for the moment of recognition, for the production of a clear, incontrovertible demonstration that continuing is not an option worth considering. The patient had been built to end things, not to fight them. The 400 years of modification had, in the judgment of the engineering team, made it significantly better at this. And the 4 years of human integration work had, in the judgment of the same team, made it better still. The patient, as it stood at the end of year 4, was a different thing from what had landed in the Arizona desert. It was still the patient. The fundamental architecture was the inheritors. The design philosophy was the chief keepers. The 4 centuries of continuous development were built into its structure in a way that no amount of modification could or should erase. But layered into that structure was a year's accumulation of human engineering, human materials science, human computational architecture, human innovation in the specific mode that human engineers produce when they are given a system that rewards engagement and told to engage with it. Akaffer, presenting the Year 4 assessment to the project leadership, said, "It is the best thing we have ever built, which is not technically accurate because we did not build it, but it is the best thing we have ever been part of, and I think that is the right way to say it." Dix, who had been on the project since the beginning and who had, in 4 years, developed the specific quality of a military man who has learned to sit with questions he cannot operationalize, asked, "Is it ready?" Akaffer thought about the word. "I think," he said, "it is the most ready it has ever been. I also think the chief keeper was right that there is always more. Those things are not in conflict." Ferris, from her position near the back of the room, said nothing. She was looking at the image on the main display, the current exterior scan of the patient in its hangar, a vessel that had arrived 800 meters of unknown metal and unknown history, and had been in 4 years, turned into something that was both of those things and also something else. Something that carried, in the hybrid components and the modified interfaces and the new layers of integration, evidence of the hands that had been working on it. The chief keeper had hoped the hands were good ones. Ferris thought about that frequently. She did not know how to assess the hands. That was not a question with a clean answer. But she knew what the hands had done with the time they had, and she thought that what the hands had done was the best answer available to the hope that had been left in the archive. She thought about good hands, and she thought about what it meant to be trusted with something by someone who could not know who would receive the trust. And she thought about the specific quality of work done in anticipation of a future you cannot see, but choose to believe in anyway. And she thought all of this quietly, in the way of someone who has been living with a problem long enough that thinking about it has become less like analysis and more like company. Then the meeting moved to the next item on the agenda, which was operational deployment planning, and Ferris put her printout away and took out her notes, because the work continuing was the point, and the work had not stopped continuing, and she did not think it would. Outside the hangar, in the desert that had absorbed 4 years of activity without apparent concern, the stars were beginning to appear in the late evening sky. The same stars that had been there before the patient arrived, the same stars that the inheritors had navigated by, the same stars that looked down on the chief keeper's final log entry, and on the Arizona highway witnesses, and on Thomas Bryce pressing a surface that felt like it was meant to be pressed. The same stars that said nothing about what was coming next because stars never do. They were just there, fixed and patient. The way things that have been around a very long time tend to be patient, waiting for the brief and busy creatures beneath them to figure out what they were doing and do it. The patient waited in the hangar, which was what it had always done. The hands that had it were working. That was enough.